Belonging to a certain social class brings such profound consequences that it's possible to make general predictions about a person's life chances in regards to education, work, crime, family, and health just by knowing his or her socioeconomic status. This may help you appreciate the respective privileges and hardships that are associated with different levels of the social hierarchy. Sociologists know that people are likely to marry or have long-term relationships with people whose social and cultural backgrounds are similar to their own. Not because they're looking for such similarities, but simply because they have more access to people like themselves. When you develop ties to classmates, fellow workers, neighbors, and members of clubs, these people may share your cultural background as well as your social class. And it's from these groups that marriage and domestic partners most often come. Social class also plays a role in the age at which people get married. The average age of first marriage for women with high school diplomas is 25, while for women with graduate degrees, it's 30. People with higher levels of education are also less likely to get divorced. The age at which people start a family and the number of children they have are also related to educational attainment. The average age at which women with a master's degree or more have their first child is 30. While the average age for women with a high school diploma is just 24. Less educated women also have a higher average number of births throughout their lifetime than more educated women. On average, women without a high school diploma have 2.8 children, whereas women with a bachelor's degree have about 1.9 children. Those at the bottom of the social class ladder are the least likely to obtain adequate nutrition, shelter, clothing, and health care, and because of that are more prone to illness. Often, they cannot afford to see a doctor, fill a prescription, or go to a hospital. So instead of preventing an illness from becoming worse, they have to wait until a health crisis occurs, and then they have no option but expensive emergency room care. Healthcare reforms, such as those provided by the Affordable Care Act, were meant to help change that pattern. A recent study out of Stanford University found that for men, the richest 1% live on average nearly 15 years longer than the poorest 1%. For women, the gap in life expectancy was just over 10 years. One factor that contributes to these disparities in health is exercise. As education and income increase, so does the likelihood of a person engaging in some physical activity. For example, only 24% of respondents living below the poverty level reported engaging in physical activity regularly, compared with 43% of those that were living at a higher income level. Education may have something to do with these disparities, as more knowledge about the health benefits of exercise may lead to more active participation. But we can also see exercise as a luxury for those in higher social classes, who are not struggling with the day-to-day efforts to survive that characterize the lives of the poor. How children perform in school determines whether and where they go to college, what professions they enter, and how much they're paid. And generally, those with more education make more money. The median annual earnings for those with advanced professional, like medical or law degrees, is over $100,000, followed by doctoral degrees at $91,000, master's degrees at $65,000, bachelor's degrees at $52,000, and high school diplomas at $31,000. On the surface, these earnings may seem fair. After all, shouldn't people with more education make more money? However, as sociologists, we have to look further and ask some more fundamental questions, like who has access to education and how good is that education? One of the main goals of education is to make sure students get a chance to succeed both in school and in life. But to meet this goal, schools would have to serve all students equally, and they are not always able to do so. Schools with low-income students often receive fewer resources, have greater difficulty in attracting qualified teachers, and experience less support from parents. A student's social class background will also influence her attitude towards education. The higher the family's socioeconomic status, the higher the student's expectations for educational achievement. Students from higher social classes are expected to complete more years of college and are more likely to attend and graduate college than those from lower social classes. It's not surprising that 84% of high school graduates from high-income families are enrolled in college compared to 64% of high school graduates from middle-income families and just 58% of high school graduates from low-income families. Even larger than the gap in college enrollment between the rich and poor is the gap in graduation rates. Young adults from families in the top income group are within 10 years of graduating high school than young adults from families at the bottom of the income group. Although educational attainment is at an all-time high in the United States, a high school education doesn't mean what it once did. College and advanced degrees are becoming more and more important, and if these trends continue, fewer and fewer jobs will be available for those without college degrees, and of those jobs, fewer will support middle-class lifestyles. Yet not all students are equally prepared for or able to afford a college education, and that creates a risk that children from lower socioeconomic backgrounds will slip further down the social class ladder. In the past couple of decades, we have seen a widening income gap between those at the top, middle, and bottom of the scale. According to a 2015 report, upper income families are 7 times more wealthy than middle income families and more than 70 times more wealthy than lower income ones. Income is the product of work, and members of a different social classes with unequal educational opportunities tend to work in different types of jobs. At the bottom of the scale, members of the lower class generally experience difficulties in the job market and may endure periods of unemployment or underemployment, which means working in a job that doesn't pay enough to support a person's needs. Among the lower class are people receiving a variety of forms of government aid. In 2016, some 2.7 million people were receiving temporary assistance for needy families, and 44.2 million were receiving help from the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program. Members of the working or lower middle class work for wages in a variety of blue-collar jobs, and they can generally earn a dependable income through skilled or semi-skilled occupations, but they may also experience periods of unemployment tied to fluctuations in the economy, layoffs, and plant closings. While factory work and other types of skilled labor were once enough to support a middle-class lifestyle, most middle-class jobs today are found in the service, information, and technology sectors. Most households here require 2 incomes to maintain a comfortable lifestyle, and many middle-class jobs require some sort of college degree. Those in the upper middle class tend to work in executive and professional fields. Some members are business owners. A small portion owns large farms or ranches. Others, known as the creative class, architects, writers, scientists, artists, professors, and engineers, tend to cluster in creative cities like Austin, San Francisco, and Seattle. Through exceptional success in any profession or art, or sometimes through inheritance, one can join the upper class. In the United States, the upper class is influential in politics, business, and culture, largely because of its economic privilege. In our highly stratified society, the top 1% consistently captures nearly a quarter of all income. Since the recession, the incomes of the top 1% have grown 37%, while the incomes of the bottom 99% have only grown by 7.6%. As a result of the recent recession in 2008, workers, most often in lower middle and lower class occupations, increasingly find themselves engaging in what is termed precarious labor. Precarious labor is work that is uncertain, unpredictable, and unprotected, such as contract labor, temporary work, or part-time work. Economic fluctuations often affect these workers first, placing them at greater risk of layoffs because of downsizing and outsourcing. Corporations seeking to cut costs have resorted to a variety of strategies. Some have restructured their workforce and made do with leaner payrolls, while others have relocated their operations overseas in countries where labor costs are lower. Both manufacturing and service jobs are subject to downsizing and outsourcing, meaning that blue-collar and white-collar workers, and even some higher-ranking executives, are now vulnerable. Their jobs and class status may be more precarious than ever before. In general, people of lower socioeconomic status are more likely to encounter the criminal justice system, whether as a perpetrator or a victim of a crime, than those of a higher socioeconomic status. But the statistics are not as straightforward as they might seem. One influential study showed that while poverty is associated with higher rates of violent crime, variables such as dense population and anomie have a greater impact on crime rates. People in lower classes are often more visible, less powerful, and thus more likely to be apprehended and labeled as criminals than those from higher social classes. There are also differences in how crimes are prosecuted. White-collar criminals are less likely to be arrested, prosecuted, or convicted than ordinary street criminals. White-collar criminals, like Enron heads Jeffrey Skilling and the late Kenneth Lay and Bernie Madoff, whose Ponzi scheme bilked wealthy clients of billions of dollars, can also afford the best legal representation and hence enjoy distinct advantages in the courtroom. If white-collar criminals are convicted, their sentences are likely to be lighter. Still, while Enron's Kenneth Lay avoided prison time by dying of a massive heart attack several months before his sentencing, Jeffrey Skilling was sentenced to 24 years in prison, and Madoff received 150 years for his crimes. How do people move from one social class to another? In other words, how do they achieve social mobility? Sociologists use the concept of social mobility to measure movement within the stratification system of a particular society, whether it's a small town, a state, or a nation. In some societies, social mobility is highly restricted by formal or informal rules. India's caste system is an example of what sociologists refer to as a closed system. There's very little opportunity for social mobility among classes. The United States, where social mobility is possible, is perceived to be an open system. But that wasn't always the case. In the period before the Civil War, slavery was widespread, keeping African Americans from climbing the social ladder. The movement of people among social classes can happen in three ways: through intergenerational mobility, intra-generational mobility, or structural mobility. Intergenerational mobility refers to the movement that occurs from one generation to the next, when a child eventually moves into a different social class from that of her parents. Americans have always placed great faith in the idea of economic mobility. Research shows that baby boomers have, for the most part, achieved upward intergenerational mobility. On the whole, they amassed more wealth during the course of their lives and consequently moved up the social class ladder. Since then, however, mobility seems to have stalled, and in the last 50 years, it has not gotten any easier to climb the social class ladder, despite progressive social policy changes that were intended to help people. In fact, since the 1980s, it has gotten much harder. New research has found that young adults today are significantly less likely than past generations of young adults to earn more than their parents. Perhaps more distressing is the finding that people born near the bottom tend to stay near the bottom. Children raised in wealthy families can expect to make 200% more income than children raised in poor families, and 75% more than those raised in middle-class families. Conversely, there are many mechanisms in place, such as tax laws and social policies, that allow those at the top of the ladder to protect their assets and pass them down to the next generation, which makes it more difficult for the middle and lower classes to improve their positions. Intra-generational mobility refers to the movement that occurs during the course of an individual's lifetime. In other words, it's the measure between the social class of a person is born to and the social class status she achieves during her lifetime. Intragenerational mobility can be measured in two directions. Horizontal social mobility, which is fairly common, refers to the changing of jobs within a social class. A therapist who shifts careers so that he can teach college experiences horizontal mobility. Vertical social mobility is movement up or down the social ladder and thus is often called upward or downward mobility. If this same therapist marries a president of a large corporation, he might experience upward mobility. On the other hand, he or his wife becomes unemployed, he might experience downward mobility. People are far more likely to experience horizontal than vertical social mobility. Although we usually think of social mobility as the result of an individual effort or lack thereof, other factors can contribute to a change in one's social class. Structural mobility occurs when large numbers of people move up or down the social ladder because of structural changes in society as a whole, particularly when the economy is affected by large-scale events. For instance, during the Great Depression of the early 1930s, precipitated by the stock market crash of 1921, huge numbers of upper and middle-class people suddenly found themselves among the poor. Conversely, during the dot-com boom of the late 1990s, developing and investing in new technologies made many people into overnight millionaires. Both of these extreme periods eventually leveled out. Still, many people in the Depression era remained in their new class, never able to climb up the social ladder ever again.